Imagine stumbling upon a shattered basalt stone slab in northern Israel, etched with ancient Aramaic inscriptions, broken and reused in later construction, yet whispering a secret that would shake the foundations of biblical skepticism. This jagged stele, once roughly a meter tall and darkened by centuries of exposure, contains the earliest known non-biblical reference to the House of David, preserved not by Israel's scribes, but by Israel's enemies. What if this single discovery forces us to rethink what we thought we knew about King David's existence? And what if archaeology finally demonstrates that this legendary king was more than a literary creation? So the question stands plainly: was King David merely a story shaped by later tradition? Or was he a real historical figure whose dynasty was known and feared beyond Israel's borders? To ensure full transparency, please note that this video uses AI-generated visuals to help bring the ancient world to life. For generations, King David has stood at the center of one of history's most heated debates. As he was revered by believers, dismissed by skeptics, and long considered archaeologically invisible, critical scholars argued that David belonged to the realm of national mythology, proposing that he was a legendary ancestor invented centuries later to unify Israel's identity and legitimize Jerusalem's kingship. Yet archaeology has a way of unsettling confident assumptions. Buried beneath layers of destruction at Tel Dan lay a voice from the ancient world itself, an enemy inscription. Not a sacred text speaking with unintended honesty about a dynasty that had already reshaped regional politics. Faith and facts. Where ancient mysteries meet modern exploration. Our thesis. Today, we reveal how a single ancient stone, the Tel Dan Stele, confirms that King David's dynasty existed outside the pages of the Bible. This is not myth-making or later theological embellishment, but an inscription carved by Israel's enemies themselves, representing an involuntary admission of David's historical legacy. Stay with us, because later in this episode we will uncover a remarkable detail about the stele's discovery process that nearly obscured its importance and delayed scholarly recognition. When understood correctly, this stone challenges claims that the Bible's kings were fictional inventions and opens the door to appreciating how archaeology and scripture intersect independently. This episode is not about blind belief or theological presupposition, but about following the evidence wherever it leads. The Tel Dan Stele stands apart precisely because it was never intended to confirm biblical history. It was royal propaganda, carved by a rival king boasting of victory. And yet, in the process, it preserved a dynastic name that critics insisted had never existed. When archaeology and the Bible converge without coordination, the result forces a reassessment of long-held academic skepticism and invites viewers to reconsider the historical depth beneath the biblical narrative. The skeptics claim. For decades, critics argued that King David was a fictional character, invented long after the period described in the Hebrew Bible, because no inscriptions mentioning David had been found. Skeptics claim that he was merely a legendary hero, preserved in oral tradition rather than a historical monarch. Without monumental architecture or external records, the biblical accounts were dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. That position changed dramatically in 1993, when archaeologists excavating the site of Tel Dan, a strategic city in northern Israel, uncovered fragments of a broken stele reused in a later wall. The inscription, written in Old Aramaic and dating to the mid-9th century BCE, was carved by an Aramean king, most likely Hazael of Damascus, who was boasting about his military victories over Israel and Judah. Within the damaged text appears the phrase House of David, a dynastic term referring to a ruling lineage rather than a mythological figure. The inscription dates to approximately 840 BC, placing it within about a century of David's reign as described in the Bible. The stele was discovered in fragments over multiple excavation seasons, and once reconstructed, it revealed a coherent royal inscription intended to intimidate defeated enemies. Measuring close to a meter in height and carved from hard basalt, The monument was physically imposing and politically intentional. This was not later legend building. It was contemporary history carved in stone. Skeptics now faced a dilemma: either dismiss the stele outright or acknowledge that David was a real historical king whose dynasty was known beyond Israel itself. Before Tel Dan, the argument against David followed a familiar pattern. BCE absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence. Minimalist scholars claimed that 10th century Israel was too small or undeveloped to support a monarchy. The Tel Dan Stele shattered that framework, not because theologians demanded it, but because an external, hostile source acknowledged a ruling house bearing David's name. The debate shifted, not through belief, but through evidence. The core evidence. Picture Tel Dan itself, a fortified city guarding Israel's northern frontier, positioned among fertile valleys and strategic trade routes. Excavations at the site revealed repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding, reflecting centuries of warfare. Embedded within one such destruction layer lay the basalt fragments of the stele, blackened by fire and weather, but still legible. The stone surface is rough and heavy, carved with deliberate Aramaic lettering that was cut deep enough to survive millennia. While the inscription is fragmentary, the phrase House of David is linguistically clear and widely accepted by the scholarly community as a dynastic reference. This was not a personal nickname or poetic flourish, but a formal political designation used by Israel's enemies. The stele was not a memorial. It was a declaration of dominance. The Aramean king proclaimed victory over the king of Israel and the ruler of the House of David, directly acknowledging Judah as a recognized political entity ruled by David's descendants. Its placement in a major frontier city reinforces the reality of a kingdom whose influence demanded public humiliation through monumental inscription. This evidence aligns with the biblical portrayal of a Davidic dynasty that continued long after David's death. Archaeological discoveries at sites associated with this period, including fortifications, administrative structures, and seals, suggest increasing political centralization during the early monarchy, consistent with the biblical framework. The Tel Dan Stele dismantles the claim that David was a literary invention, because it anchors his dynasty in the physical world, acknowledged by an enemy who had no reason to support Israel's traditions. Even the choice of basalt reinforces the stele's purpose, because basalt was difficult to carve and expensive to transport, making it a deliberate investment in permanence. Ironically, in attempting to immortalize his own triumph, the Aramean king permanently preserved the name of David. What was intended as humiliation became historical confirmation. Contextual proof. The Tel Dan Stele is more than a stone. It is a window into a volatile, ancient world where rival kingdoms competed for survival and dominance. Scripture describes David as rising from obscurity to establish a dynasty that endured for centuries. And until this discovery, some scholars doubted that such a dynasty ever existed. At this point, consider the implications. If Israel's enemies recognize the House of David as a legitimate ruling power, what does that mean for claims that the biblical account is pure mythology? Beyond confirming David's existence, the stele fits within a broader archaeological picture that includes evidence of urban development, administrative control, and regional conflict during the monarchy. While archaeology does not prove theology, it consistently confirms the Bible's historical framework. The political tone of the inscription reveals that David's legacy endured long after his death, because even hostile kings defined Judah by his name. This challenges theories that David was merely a minor tribal leader retroactively inflated by later writers. Finds from Jerusalem's City of David, along with seals and fortifications attributed to the monarchy, further reinforce this picture. The Tel Dan Stele stands as a cornerstone within that cumulative case, an external voice affirming the biblical story. What makes the stele especially compelling is that it fits seamlessly into the biblical timeline. Because Scripture records conflict between Israel and Aram during this very period. text and terrain converge to reveal a politically complex world behaving exactly as the Bible describes. Conclusion. Here is the remarkable detail. The Tel Dan Stele fragments were discovered over multiple excavation seasons, and their significance only became clear through careful reconstruction and scholarly persistence. Had those fragments gone unrecognized, one of the most important extra-biblical confirmations of David's dynasty might have remained buried in obscurity. Today, the Tel Dan Stele stands as the earliest archaeological evidence that King David was not a legend, but a historical ruler whose dynasty shaped the ancient Near East. This discovery reshaped scholarly debate and forced a reassessment of long-standing skepticism. To ensure full transparency, please note that this video uses AI-generated visuals to bring history to life. Had those fragments never been pieced together, the debate over David's existence might still hinge on speculation rather than evidence. Instead, stone preserved what memory alone could not. The Tel Dan Stele reminds us that truth often survives by narrow margins, and that archaeology continues to recover voices long silenced by time. When stone confirms Scripture, it is not faith that changes, but history that catches up. If you found the evidence in this deep dive compelling, remember that the mission of Faith and Facts is to challenge skepticism by demonstrating that the Bible is one of the most archaeologically grounded documents of the ancient world. To explore the full scope of this evidence, watch our documentary compilation Kings and Kingdoms, the Davidic Dynasty Unveiled, where these discoveries are brought together into a single historical narrative. If you want to support this work, hit like, subscribe for weekly evidence updates, and share this video with one thoughtful skeptic, you know? Together, we uncover the past one inscription at a time, because every artifact brings us closer to understanding the biblical world. Not as myth, but as lived history. Faith and Facts exists to bridge scholarship and belief, demonstrating that when archaeology speaks, it often echoes Scripture with remarkable clarity.